Welcome to One on One. I'm Greg Bassett, your host from the Salisbury Independent newspaper. It's a big day here at PAC 14. They're all big, but we've got a big newsmaker in the house today, William McDermott. He is the Deputy State's Attorney for Wycomico County. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and please call me Billy.
Billy, so you're in our paper this week with an announcement, some discussion about this new initiative you have at the State's Attorney's Office. You're the number 2 person there behind Jamie Dykes. This Prosecutor Integrity Unit, Prosecutorial Integrity Unit. I know I should know the name better than that, but tell me all about this thing.
Yeah, no, I appreciate, first I appreciate you asking me about it, but I also certainly appreciate the Independent giving us an opportunity to speak to the community. And I kind of want to address that too, because you offered that opportunity to us, and it's been such a wonderful vehicle. You know, we work in a very formulaic system. There are processes that have to be followed when you're in the criminal justice system. And one of the offsets of that is that we have gotten accustomed to communicating with the public through press releases.
Right.
Which can be terribly formulaic. The opportunity to speak in a more informal tone and to have a conversation like you and I are having, it has been so well received, and we've gotten so much good feedback about that type of communication. I just want to say how deeply appreciative we are.
And we'll talk about the SU graffiti thing, because that was a very good example of what you're talking about.
But with respect to prosecution integrity, yes. So there is, I think we can all agree, a national conversation happening right now, spurred by a lot of different events that seem to come together into a melting pot where people are taking a hard look and re-examining the roles of both police officers and prosecutors, not just within the criminal justice system, but perhaps within society in general. And in the context of that conversation, and using that conversation as a backdrop, there have been certain things within our own community over the last 18 months or so that have necessitated us having that conversation perhaps in advance of the national conversation. And so we looked toward the creation of units all around the country, and we tried to pick the best pieces of those units and come up with our own idea. And you know, Jamie Dykes went out into the community, and she had a lot of meetings with interested stakeholders. We met with the chief of police of Salisbury PD. We've had lots of conversations with the sheriff about this. And one of the things that we kept coming back to was kind of the short-sightedness of these other units that have been created. And typically speaking, the other units are called conviction integrity units. And while that has a place, they can be really high hurdles for people to overcome. And I'll give you an example. We recently were in talks with the Attorney General's office about creating a statewide conviction integrity unit that would have been staffed by different prosecutors from all over the state. Not so much a problem, but one of the shortcomings of that process was, in order for you, if you were a defendant, let's say you'd been accused of something, in order for you to qualify for conviction integrity review, you would have had to had a claim of actual innocence, which means it's not that you had a procedural defect in your trial, which can be just as much of an injustice as actually not having done something. You would have had to have new evidence that wasn't discovered in time for trial or during the appellate process, which is also another high hurdle. And you would have had to have been sentenced, I think the cutoff was 60 years. So you'd have to be serving an active sentence of 60 years or more. That narrows down the list of people who are eligible for that kind of relief to a very, very small window. And what became apparent to us is, if we're going to talk about integrity, convictions are too late. The place for integrity is in that whole place. You know, conviction's a noun, prosecution's a verb, and looking at the entire system and making sure that we are putting the proper checks and balances on our own authority and ensuring that the process itself has integrity was something that was really important. And so we decided to create a prosecution integrity unit versus a conviction integrity unit. We took that idea to the county council. They rightfully had lots of questions. They wanted to know more about the process. They wanted to know about how it intersected with our local issues to involve the Salisbury Police Department's property facilities and other issues that have kind of tangentially come up as a result of that. And in doing all of that, we came to a place with the county council where we had buy-in from them, we had buy-in from the county executive, and testament to their leadership and their forward thinking, we now have one funded position, a prosecutor, a full-time prosecutor. We have a full-time investigator. And while that may seem like a small unit to some, one prosecutor, one investigator, I'll tell you that we were recently told that the city of Baltimore may have only, I think, 2 devoted to this kind of review. And so I think we're going to be way ahead of the game, and we're going to be able to look forward to processes and policies that are reflective of not just the national conversation, but perhaps some of those issues which have been affecting us locally. It's really exciting as a person who has been, I think, a faithful steward of the criminal justice system to see us get to this place.
Well, that's interesting because that's where things have been headed so much. It's not always the end result so more, but how things are conducted in the meantime. So we don't always look at convictions the same way. We look at how the officers conducted themselves in making the arrest and pursuing justice.
Yes, and that's a great point. And here's what I'll say, and I want to really be clear on this point. The national conversation is a national conversation, and that's the wonderful thing about being able to affect change on the local level. What applies, solutions that may be for Baltimore or Annapolis or Philadelphia, New York, may not be solutions for us. And what I want to be really clear about is, and I mentioned this in the article, there are people around the country who are calling for the abolition of police departments. They're calling for defunding the police officers. They're calling for top-to-bottom restructuring of prosecutors' offices. I don't think, first of all, I strongly disagree with that proposition for a lot of reasons that we don't have time to get into now. Least of which, of course, has been that I've been witness to. As a prosecutor, we get the calls at 2 a.m. I've gone out and seen law enforcement officers. Valiance is an understatement. Heroism is probably the right word. And prosecutors as well, who routinely, almost always, trade time with their families to make sure that strangers get justice. And so I want to be clear that I don't know, you talk about the process, and journalism is actually a really great analogy. There are a lot of good journalists who probably practice ethical standards the way they should. There might be one or two that don't. It's the same issue, right? No system is perfect. There might be one or two police officers somewhere that are bad apples. And those people have to be dealt with appropriately. They have to be held accountable. And to the extent that there are probably prosecutors somewhere. But I am confident more than ever that in our area, in our local area, not only do we have the finest law enforcement probably anywhere, but we also have, and I can say without a shadow of a doubt, we have a group of selfless and dedicated prosecutors that are unlike any group of people I've ever had the privilege of working with, and I couldn't be more proud to work with them.
Yeah, when I've been in court, and I'm getting some in court more than most people as a reporter, and I see the prosecutors, and I'm just so impressed with how they have to conduct themselves and what they're up against. And I've always said this, the idea of putting bad guys in jail is the greatest service you can do the community. But as Jamie and others have always said, it's not really about that. There's a much more complicated relationship.
You know, it's interesting. So we have ethical canons that govern not just the conduct of lawyers, but there are actually special canons that govern the conduct of prosecutors. And one of the first among them is the definition of a prosecutor. And it says that a prosecutor should be a minister of justice. Now, I always understood, like when I first started practicing, I used to think of the word minister in the context of like when you think of ministers in like overseas capacities. In Great Britain, they have ministers.
Right.
But in actuality, if you do the research, it actually was meant in the more religious sense.
I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah, neither did I. So minister in the way that we preach the good word. We preach the good word of justice. And so I used to say that. People would ask, particularly young children, to say, like, what is a prosecutor? And I'd say, well, we put bad guys in jail. I don't think that's accurate.
Right.
Because the truth is, unlike any other part of the criminal justice system, prosecutors have discretion. We have the ability to do the right thing all the time. If a case isn't there, if it doesn't have probable cause, we don't have to sign on. We don't have to issue charges. If we think a case needs to be dropped for certain reasons, we can do that. We have the ability at every single point within the system to interject ourselves and to say, stop, or go forward. That's an incredible burden that we carry, but it is also something that I think all good prosecutors recognize and are really, we take that responsibility not just when we're in the courtroom, but you've mentioned, courtroom responsibilities are a very small part of our duties. We get calls regularly. We're on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We're on crime scenes. We are the people who sit in kitchens with victims and talk about the likelihood of success at trial or the possibility of taking a plea or what it looks like when somebody successfully appeals a conviction because a technicality has arose that provides them with a mechanism for relief. There is so much to being a prosecutor. I could talk all day, and I'm very passionate about it, and I love talking about it. And so I don't want to belabor this or be more verbose than necessary, but I will tell you that it's a very hard job, but it's a job that if If you're doing it because you love it, and that's the only reason.
It's funny you talk about going to crime scenes, and I've never talked to anyone about this in detail. I think I talked to Matt Messarella about it a little bit. But I remember being a reporter, when I would be at a crime scene, you always wanted to be invisible while you were there because you were going to get kicked off the crime scene if a police officer saw that you were there.
Sure.
Especially if you got a camera. They did not want that interference.
I
They
can
didn't want
imagine.
anything to jeopardize that. But when the state's attorney's people would show up, you could see the police would be like very excited about what was going on, and they were very intense. And the prosecutors would come, and they were more disciplined and reserved, and they would say, "Did you talk to that guy? Did you do fingerprints there? What about this thing over here?" And it would keep them in check because you guys were going to have to work as a team later when it got to a court phase, and you wanted to make sure that they were conducting themselves exactly right. And I was always fascinated by that relationship.
So it's it's an interesting part of our job. I like to play poker. One of the best things that I can do at my spare time is find a good poker game to be a part of. And the reason I enjoy it so much is because it's not about the hand that you're holding. It's about 10 hands from now,
Right.
And what somebody may read into what you're doing.
Right.
And so one of the things that I enjoy most about our job is the strategy, the strategery of decisions. And when we are on scene, prosecutors are, like you said, thinking 10 steps ahead. We're not just thinking about what we need to do to get to the next piece of evidence that's collected. We're thinking about what happens if the evidence that they just collected gets suppressed, and what motions, what arguments could be made, are proper policies and procedures being followed. And so I won't lie to you, though. It's exciting when that might be one of the most exciting parts of the job, is being able to have that relationship where we can go out to a crime scene, we can be part of it. And some people ask us, I've heard this question before, going out there, does that provide you with any conflicts? Could it possibly? And the argument is that there could. If you become a sole witness to something, there is an issue with that. But what we always remind people of is, at the end of this, right, forget the 10 steps, think 100 steps into the future. If this results in a trial, ultimately I'm going to be the person who stands before 12 people within the community, or a detached and neutral magistrate. And my job in either opening or closing statements is going to be to articulate to them what happened. I can only articulate so much by reading what's on a paper. I can't tell you what it smelled like. I can't tell you what it felt like. I can't tell you what it hurt, what it sounded like. To be able to paint the leaves on that tree by way of articulation, you can only get if you're on scene and you see it for yourself. And so that has been an enormous benefit, and it's a courtesy too. And it's a testament that law enforcement trusts us that way to invite us to be part of that process, because that is their process, and we are invited as a courtesy.
And then the other thing I see when you're on the scene is that the attorney people will often bond with the victim's family, or friends, people that are there, in a way the police don't. So it almost becomes more personal for you because you know the people that have been affected by this crime.
It's true. So if the part of the job I enjoy the most is strategy, I have to say, like, a close second, if not like equally tied, is the relationships I get to have with victims and with victims' families and community members. Throughout the years, I've had occasion to work on more than 24 homicides, and I can tell you
Right.
all about every one of their families. I can tell you a lot about them, because when you meet with them in that circumstance, there is a bond that is created almost instantaneously. Sometimes you have to, and rightfully so, you have to earn it. But those are people that you never lose track of. They're still I was with Jamie yesterday. We were having a meeting about something, and one of her victims from a case that she had worked just texted her and said, like, "Hope you're doing okay today." That relationship is just, I can't describe it. It's
Yeah.
I was telling you before we went on camera about the Jamil Gould homicide and the victims in that matter, and those victims are children. I can't tell you, I really can't tell you first what it feels like when you get a good result, when you've carried that pressure, when you've lived with that case, and you stand behind those victims, and you stand before a jury and they come back with a guilty verdict. The relief that you feel, but then, the worst part about this job is a reality starts to seep in, and that reality is, no matter what the result is for us in court, their loved one's never coming back. Erica Gould's never gonna spend another holiday or another birthday with her kids, and that reality maybe maintains our bond, because we both share that pain and that loss.
How did you get into this? What is your background? How did you decide you wanted to be a prosecutor?
So I like to joke that I'm just a simple alpaca farmer from Girdletree, which nobody even knows what Girdletree is.
Well,
let alone,
I'm from Ironshire, so we're pretty much kin.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
We only have box iron between us.
That's true. I didn't know that, Greg.
Yeah.
Greg. It was actually, it was very fortuitous, might not be the right word, but when I was in high school, I think my mom was a little concerned that I wasn't going to amount to much, and it was it wasn't a misplaced concern because I don't know that I had a lot of direction, and so what she started doing was she started just exploring things within the community that we could go see for free, and so after school, Mom brought me to the courthouse, and I remember the trial. It was a rape trial, and Joel Todd, who was former state's attorney in Worcester County, was prosecuting.
Is it the old courthouse in Snow Hill?
Yeah, Judge Eschenberg was on the bench. I remember so much about it, and I sat there and I remembered just being enamored with what was happening because it was like what you saw on TV, except Courtroom 1 in Worcester County is this very ornate. There's black oak from the Pocomoke Forest. There's just so much history. And I remember sitting there and just thinking to myself, like, I want to do this. And then I came back, Mom and we came back a couple of times, and I figured out that the prosecutors had the best job in the room. And I knew from that moment forward that not only did I want to be a lawyer, but I wanted to be a prosecutor. And so I went to college and I went to law school, and I had the great fortune of meeting Judge Oglesby, and forming a really deep relationship with him. And as soon as before I graduated law school, he hired me as a law clerk. And then as soon as I graduated past the bar, I was brought on as an assistant state's attorney, then the executive assistant state's attorney, then I was appointed the deputy. Then I got the ad interim spot, and then I became the deputy in Wicomico. Now, in between there, I lost an election, but I hate talking about that.
Well, people confused you with
kidding.
Mike McDermott. That's what happened there.
Well, and to make things even more confusing, I have a brother, Mike McDermott, like an actual younger brother, Mike McDermott.
Right.
So, that's where how I got into being a prosecutor.
So what's it like in Wicomico? It seems like Wicomico has different problems than Worcester.
It does, yeah. So to begin with, and I don't know that I realized this until I got here, Wicomico is a lot larger than Worcester. In Worcester County, we have 10 prosecutors and support staff. We are literally more than double that in Wicomico County. So it's a much bigger office, which provides its own interesting dynamics. Crime-wise, it's interesting. There is more violent crime in here, but I don't know if that's not population per capita equal. The interesting parts are the relationships with the law enforcement officers and the agencies. I've been here something like 15 months or so, maybe 18 months. I'm bad with math. But in that time, being able to connect with law enforcement the way that we used to connect with law enforcement in Worcester and build those relationships has just been wonderful. And in fairness to Jamie, she is a wonderful person to work for, and she has excellent vision for what this county needs to be.
You guys have been in the news here recently. There was a situation with the Salisbury Police Department. I interviewed Barbara Duncan actually this week, the chief. And rather than talk about all the particulars, I'm just referring people to read all the stories on our website,
Sure.
salisburyindependent.net, if they want to know all the details. But that was an awkward thing that you got pulled into, and you had to sort of be the arbiter on this and determine what happened.
Yeah, I don't know that I would call it awkward because that's our job, right? And sometimes our jobs are uncomfortable. And I'm reluctant to talk specifics just because
and I don't
ongoing.
expect that, yeah.
But there is an ongoing investigation involving the property facilities at Salisbury Police Department. To the extent that that has required outside counsel, it has, and the Office of the State Prosecutor is involved in that investigation and potentially prosecution should it get to that point. There are tangential issues that are related to that central issue that have kind of evolved into bigger issues that we have been forced to deal with. But we have statutory obligations in addition to constitutional concerns. Maryland Rule 4263, which is generally our circuit court discovery rule, requires us to disclose certain things. And so there were disclosures that were put out. Those were in the news, and certainly your readers and your viewers can refer to those. But that relationship, right, like you've talked about how we get when we get onto crime scenes. Being able to have relationships is basically everything when it comes to working through these issues. The ability to sit down and kind of troubleshoot issues, and I think we've done that. We still have a lot of work to do, and perhaps not the beginning, but the Prosecution Integrity Unit is designed for that purpose.
Right.
For those types of interactions, for those types of issues, and dealing with them not just in the immediacy of, like, say, a disclosure, but what litigation might result as those disclosures become important to defendants, and then perhaps even retrying cases if cases need to be retried.
It was interesting, in January, February, we had State's Attorney Dykes on TV, and we had scheduled her before the poopy hit the fan on all this stuff. But one of the things that came up then was the SU graffiti thing had sort of come up. And this had been a recurring issue. It had happened, but then it happened in a bad way where they had to close the university for a day, and there was a lot going on. And there wasn't really the evidence to charge anyone at the time. And I remember, and I was getting calls from readers saying, what's going on? Why won't they charge this guy? We all know who did it. Like, no one really knew, but people thought they knew in the gossip community of the barbershops. And so I thought, well, this thing's going to go away. They're never going to be able to charge anyone. But then you all were able to make a charge and have a plea in the situation with the Salisbury University graffiti. Tell me how that happened.
There's a lot to that story. So first, let's start with, like, Jamie is absolutely right in that we don't charge people to make statements. We have ethical obligations, and we follow those ethical obligations wherever they go. And that's a really hard thing to do in our current environment, because if, in all candor, social media can be so deafening when it comes to the cross noise, and people think, like you said,
They
like,
convict people, yeah.
Right? They say, we
throw
know
them in jail, whatever that means.
We know who did it. Right. Why don't we just skip the whole due process thing? Let's just go straight to the sentencing phase. And, like, why aren't you guys doing that?
Right.
And what is so, and it's frustrating as a prosecutor, because I want to say to them, listen, if your loved one had been accused of a crime, you wouldn't be telling me to, like, skip the whole due process thing and throw them. You would be pumping the brakes. You'd be screaming from the rooftops,
yeah.
Where's our justice?
Yeah.
That's what we do. And I mentioned this in the article, but that's the hard part about being a prosecutor. You're almost always going to make one side unhappy. And so
and let's mention that real quick. Yeah. Billy wrote a great article in our paper that explained the behind the scenes in a way that, as a reporter, rather than him tell me and me write it down.
Yeah. And so I'll try to kind of give you a little bit of a background on that. So I worked on that case. So Jamie was working on that case. She was integral on it. But also the assigned prosecutor and myself was Ajay Turnbull. Ajay Turnbull he's an incredible guy. I worked with him in Montgomery County. I brought him to Worcester. And then, I followed him to Wicomico. He's an incredible person and did a lot of really hard work on this, and worked directly with Sergeant Craven, who also deserves a lot of recognition in addition to the chief in this process. But what was interesting about that case is, and what was something that we struggled with, this was something that touched a nerve with a lot of people. There were people who, certainly students on campus, faculty on campus, who rightfully so questioned whether or not they were safe on campus based on the things that were being said. These were, let's be very clear, the things that were being written on the walls, let's bring Sandy Hook to Salisbury University, that's enough to scare anybody. The anonymity of the person doing it was even scarier, because in a lot of ways, if somebody were standing on the corner holding that sign, at least that's a known quantity. But this, for a lot of people, was a person lurking in the shadows, someone who wanted to conceal who they were, and to a large extent, that was what perpetrated the fear. And so we had this group of people who were very concerned about what happened. When we met with the Salisbury Police Department, one of the things that Salisbury University has a really good attribute is their video cameras. They have an amazing, high-quality video camera system, and they have lots of cameras everywhere. You would think, however, that it would be very easy to see, like, okay, well, who did it? I think to a large extent Mr. Jackson was aware that they had these very good cameras, but also every place that he decided to author these messages, there was no camera footage. And so what we had to do as investigators, what Sergeant Craven, Mr. Turnbull, had to go through hours of videotape, stitching together locations everywhere, following Mr. Jackson's move from the moment he arrived on campus in his black BMW, where we could see his license plate, we could see his face. We'd have to track every single movement. And we never actually were to a place where we could say, there he is writing on the wall. Rather, what we would have to do is say, okay, there's the wall. We know he's in this area. There's no exit. There's no ingress, egress. And so we had to put together what was a very strong circumstantial case. And it was a very strong it's probably the strongest circumstantial case I've ever seen. It's worth noting now that if we were in court right now and we were doing jury instructions, a judge would tell a jury that there is no difference in the law between direct evidence and circumstantial evidence. Direct evidence would be, I don't know, if I look out the window and I see it's raining. Circumstantial would be if I'm sitting here and you walk in and you're wet and you have an umbrella that's wet. Circumstantially, I could say it was raining. So the court draws no distinction in the law. And so we had to do hours of that work. Then we had to do hours of interviewing all the people who found it, didn't find it. Mr. Jackson gave an interview. We had to do search warrants of his home, his vehicle, his cell phones. There were lots and lots of I's that needed to be dotted and T's that needed to be crossed because we all understood the sensitivity of this issue. You know, the elephant in the room is that Mr. Jackson is an African American. And while that didn't change the outlook at all, it's certainly something where when you're putting this all together and you're looking at the concern and the outrage from the community, we were cognizant of that fact, at least to the extent that regardless of what happened in terms of charging or in trial, that was going to be something that affected other people, even if it didn't affect us. And so we met with the Salisbury University executive staff and the police department, and ultimately we reached the same conclusion, which was Salisbury University was hurting from this. They were suffering financially, they were suffering reputation-wise within the greater community, and so a quick resolution was something that was imperative to them. Imperative to us is that all people get treated equally and that they're held accountable. And so weighing all of that, we used the pre-trial plea agreement. And we actually met with Mr. Jackson and his lawyer. We sat in our conference room and we gave him a seat at the table. And Ajane and I, we ran through, we had a whiteboard, we had digital evidence, we had the videotape, and we basically did a mock trial and presented our case to his lawyer and to him and said, listen, this is what we have. Nothing, no cards being held from you. This is where we are. This is what we believe a fair plea to be. You have a week to think about it. We allowed him to ask questions. He did ask questions through his lawyer. And I think at the end of that, what ended up being the result, and Judge Marsh, her words ring in the back of my head. She said, this is justice. It was an inclusive process from conception all the way through to the adjudication. And the one last thing I'll say, because I've talked enough about this already, but the one last thing I'll say is we live in a society right now, we've talked about the national conversation, we've talked about how people are perhaps inherently now distrustful of the system. It is a far different thing to have a person walk into a court of law and say, I did it, I'm guilty. Even though that person doesn't say I'm sorry, just the acknowledgement that they take responsibility versus a judge or even a jury that perhaps people don't trust to be a jury of their peers anymore. To have that as the result was able to provide finality and I hope a good dose of healing to the Salisbury University campus.
Well, Billy, good luck with this prosecution integrity unit. We're going to be watching it closely. It's great that you guys are getting involved so that people can have input in what goes on and feel like they're part of the process. And we really appreciate all you do. And thanks for being here today.
Greg, thank you for having me. We greatly appreciate all that you've given us.
Thank you.
Yep.
He's Billy McDermott. He's the Deputy State's Attorney for Wycombe County, Maryland, and we're thrilled that he had time to be with us here today. I'm Greg Bassett from the Salisbury Independent Newspaper, another edition of 101 right here on PAC 14.
First Shore Federal is proud to support PAC 14 and one-on-one. We'd encourage every business to support PAC 14 and pick a program and support it, and let's make a difference.